Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Who was Anthony Comstock? Our guest today is going to tell us why the 19th century Comstock Act still poses a threat to women's rights today.
The Freedom From Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Welcome to Freethought Matters. What is the Comstock Act and how much harm did it create? Our guest today will tell us more about Anthony Comstock, the women he persecuted, and the dangers that act still poses today. Amy Sohn has written a fascinating nonfiction book called The Man Who Hated Women: Sex, Censorship, and Civil Liberties in the Gilded Age. A former columnist at the New York Magazine, Amy Sohn has also written for Harper's Bazaar, Elle, The Nation, and the New York Times. A native New Yorker, she's authored 5 novels, including Prospect Park West and Motherland.
Welcome to Freethought Matters, Amy Sohn.
Thank you. It's great to see you guys again.
So Amy, who would have thought that in 2024, the Comstock Act would be in the news and threatening women's rights again?
You know, I remember when I got my book contract talking to my editor. This was maybe in 2019 or 20, and he said, for all the wrong reasons, I think your book is going to continue to be relevant for some time. The presidential election had not happened that brought us Donald Trump, and what's going on now with these, I love that candidate Harris is calling them Trump abortion laws, in a very similar way to the way that Comstock was sort of branded as the public face of, you know, as I say in the book, The Man Who Hated Women. The Harris campaign is being very strategic about branding Trump himself as anti-abortion because he appointed the justices who overturned Roe.
And I have to say, just as an announcement, that we don't take a partisan stand on this show.
Yeah.
But when your book came out, you wouldn't have been able to imagine that those 2 Supreme Court justices, Alito and Thomas, would talk this year about the Comstock Act as if it was good law.
This is a whole new world. And, you know, I was born the same year as Roe in 1973. So it's interesting for me as a woman, you know, who came of age in an era of relative, you know, what we believed were relatively assured abortion rights, to see that whole landscape changing and the impact that it's having on women and on reproductive providers.
So we're going to hear more in a minute about Anthony Comstock and the religious motivations behind his act. But can I read just a short passage from your book?
I'd love it.
You write, "The Comstock era revealed the danger that ensues when a virulent, well-funded, highly connected, determined man gains access to political power and will stop at nothing to keep it. Today, 150 years after Comstock prayed to God for his bill to pass, we are still fighting over women's bodies." So who was Anthony Comstock and what was driving him?
Anthony Comstock was born in 1844 in New Canaan, Connecticut, a very rural agrarian community. His parents were Congregationalists, and the family's entire life centered around church. He was extremely close to his mother, who gave him his moral values. And really, one of the most shocking things I discovered while researching his life is that his mother actually died of a hemorrhage following the birth of her sixth child, Anthony's younger sister, Harriet. And that happened when he was 10 years old, and he came home and found his mother, as he wrote about it, the loveliest mother that ever lived, dead. And this event, which was probably the most traumatic event of his life, aside from the death of his only biological child to a diarrhea-related illness in infancy, this event of his mother's death was catalytic for him. He lost his moral anchor, and he believed that his mother had died doing the ultimate service, of course, which was being fruitful and multiplying. It was called the Victorian ideal. And in this view of women that they held, the woman was the anchor of family life, and her highest purpose was to her husband, her children, and God. Anthony's brother enlisted in the Civil War and died at Gettysburg, and he followed in his footsteps. His service was pretty uneventful, but he had a real talent for record keeping, and that was where he started developing this kind of obsessive record-keeping mind. He was not well liked in his regiment. He would pour out his liquor ration instead of giving it to his fellow soldiers. That is not a good way to make friends. At one time, he came back to his bunk and found that a literal trash fire had been set on his bed. And so, he was certainly not the only man in the Civil War with a strong sense of religion, but he began to feel as though he was different from other men. And he was a compulsive masturbator who wrote in his diary about his feelings of guilt over this. So he was a young man, struggling with these things. And then he moves to New York after the Civil War to try to make it as a dry goods salesman. And at the time that he's in New York, if you've ever read the wonderful book Low Life, this was the era of sex was everywhere. There were obscene books. There was one estimate that about 10% of all women between 15 and 30 prostituted themselves in New York in some way or another at this time. This was the sporting era of saloons and cigar shops. They would have these shops that fronted as cigar shops, but you could hire a girl, in a room above the shop. And so he was really overwhelmed by just vice all around him. And what seems to be the inciting incident in his decision to go after, at first, obscene reading materials and then birth control materials is that a friend of his at his dry goods shop became sick. We don't know whether this person caught a venereal disease from a prostitute, whether he had a sickness, and perhaps Anthony in his mind linked that to masturbation because, at the time it was common belief that masturbation led to insanity and, sickness. But after this event, he decided that he wanted to try to do something about the obscene book trade. So you can see right away in his mind there was this connection between obscene reading material and danger. And so he began basically ratting out these booksellers. Now, at the time in New York City, the police department was notoriously corrupt. And some of the time he would tell the cops about these dirty bookstores and they didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to do anything about it, probably because they were customers. But he eventually wrote a letter to the YMCA, which was still fairly new in the United States, and said that he wanted to do something about the obscene book trade. And right around the time he sent this letter, they too were becoming concerned about what it meant to be a young man in New York at this time, when we were exposed to fighting and billiards and prostitution. And so it was this kind of perfect match of the right man for the job and the right sentiment. And so eventually what happened was that they funded him on several trips to Washington to pass what became known as the Comstock Law, which was passed in 1873 following the Credit Mobilier scandal, which was this railroad scandal. And it was a moment in American history when they kind of needed an easy win. And obscenity law was an easy win. And he succeeded in getting this law passed, which criminalized the mailing of both obscene reading materials and contraception with extremely stiff sentences and fines. And it was the first time in American history that contraception itself was defined as obscenity.
So, and also abortifacients. Didn't it mention abortifacients?
Both.
Yes.
And it also sex toys.
So it also did this weird thing, eventually, where it deputized him, correct, to enforce his own law.
Yes, he became special agent to the U.S. Post Office. It was always a strange position. He took a very minimal salary, but he was also secretary of the New York Society for the Prevention, I was getting my acronyms, for the prevention of vice. And so he had a privately funded salary as a vice hunter while he was in a public position as special agent to the U.S. Post Office. And one of the things he was notorious for was decoying people. He would travel to cities like Greenwich, Connecticut, not far from New York City, specifically to request various materials, like you were saying, contraception, abortifacients, and obscene reading material through the mail so that it could cross state lines and be a federal crime. And his methods were extremely controversial. Decoying, a lot of times it seemed as though he was instigating people to take action, that it was done in bad faith. And it didn't stop him at all that he was so hated and reviled. And he carried a revolver. He chased one. I think it was a New Haven doctor down a flight of stairs and landed on top of him. He was a big guy. It was kind of fascinating. He had this combination of thuggishness and just extreme religiosity. And he was a very well-known public character. He was satirized in cartoons. And over the course of his life, he died in 1915, the tide really shifted, and he came to seem out of touch with the times as our nation was moving toward the idea that families should make these decisions about how many children to have for themselves.
I love that cartoon from the 19th century, dragging in a woman in a nightgown. Your Honor, this woman has given birth to a naked child. So he was satirized a great deal, as you say. He was sort of a buffoon, and yet he had all this power.
Yeah, and I think in similar ways as to some of what we're seeing in American politics today, there was this question of, could you take his power away by mocking him? I think another thing that it's sort of hard for us, or maybe not so hard for us to understand as the tide has shifted so much, is that he represented something that came to be called Comstockism. And it was more than just restricting women's safe abortion and access to varying levels of contraceptives, some that were more effective than others. It was a way of thinking. And the idea was that women should not make these decisions for themselves. It was a misogynistic way of thinking, although he never would have called himself the man who hated women. He believed that he revered women. He didn't really understand holistically the connection between, for example, poverty and sex work. In other words, he got in some ways that women needed help, but he also judged them. He judged women who turned to sex work, without thinking about the fact that, women's wages at this time were extremely low. And it was very, very hard for women to make a decent living as a milliner or, in occupations like that.
So he did ruin many lives. Is it true that Anthony Comstock bragged about how many people had committed suicide because of him?
D.M. Bennett, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the noted freethinker and publisher of The Truth Seeker magazine, claimed that Comstock had bragged that he had caused 16 suicides. In my book, I write about Madame Restel, who was one of the most notorious abortion providers in New York, and she did actually take her own life.
Let's talk about her. We're just going to take a small break, and when we come back, we want to concentrate on some of the women that Comstock persecuted and prosecuted.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. There are many reasons why I'm an atheist, but I'll start with the crudest explanation. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct, and they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Amy Sohn, author of the book, The Man Who Hated Women.
So, Amy, your book concentrates on some of the women, many of the women Comstock prosecuted, and these include famous people like Margaret Sanger and Emma Goldman, but some lesser-known individuals who really paved the way for the birth control movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about that so-called wickedest woman in New York, Madame Restel?
Yes, she was the most famous abortionist in New York. She called herself Madame, but she was either Scottish or English. Her husband was a printer, and which is what's so fascinating is that she was in a radical world, and we believe she learned the abortion trade from someone downtown who was providing them, and then she was kind of a brilliant marketer of herself. The reason for calling herself Madame was anything French was associated with sex. So if they would, this is where we get the term French tickler. French was a code not only for various sex toys, but for contraception and abortion. And she operated opposite St. Patrick's Cathedral, almost, waving it in the face of the establishment. And she was a complex woman. She had already served time by the time Comstock went after her again in 1878. And at that point, she was close to 70 years old. I don't want to give all of the details away, but she became convinced that she was going to die at the Women's Workhouse on Blackwell's Island, which is present-day Roosevelt Island in New York City, and slit her own throat the night before her sentencing. A maid found her in the tub. And she was another of these larger-than-life figures. For years, there were rumors that she wasn't actually dead. and that the body had been switched, and in fact she had escaped to Canada. I mean, so she really represented someone who was strong in his imagination. He needed an extremely high profile subject to go after. And so the Madame Ristel case really cemented him in the minds of people who supported what he was doing as tough on abortionists, but also I think many people felt quite sympathetic that this 60-something-year-old grandmother had slit her own throat because she was afraid she would die in prison. And something quite remarkable about him is that he was really unafraid of the public perception, what it might seem like to be sending older women to prison for the rest of their lives. He was undeterred by the distaste people would have for the way he treated people.
Do you know how many people ultimately that he arrested and were found guilty?
It was in the hundreds, maybe even in the thousands. And to be clear, most of the people that he went after were men. But I write about 8 women because I really wanted to give voice to these kind of eccentric, strange women who were really going against commonly perceived ideas of what women should be and should do.
Well, we don't have time to go into a great deal of detail, but one of those women that you concentrate a lot about was Ida Craddock, another suicide. And briefly, what was her importance to the development of sex education and the birth control movement?
Ida Craddock wrote these marriage manuals that were essentially guides for the wedding night. I mean, imagine what it was like to be a young person and not know what was going to happen, not know anything about your body. That was the case with many, many young people. They struggled to get real information. And so Ida Craddock believed that she was married to a ghost who she called Soph. And so she went by the name Mrs. Ida Craddock, which, depending on how you look at it, was either her true belief that she was married to someone in the astral plane, or also extremely savvy marketing, because if she was a single, unmarried virgin, how could she proclaim to know anything about sex? She's really a fascinating character, and she and Comstock first, we think that they were both at the World's Fair watching the belly dancers in 1893, which was this kind of key moment in his development as a public vice hunter, because of course he tried to get the belly dances shut down, and her birth as this defender of the belly dance and educator of marital sex techniques.
The belly dance is going to send us all to hell, isn't it? He also went after some Freethought rationalist publications for simply talking about sex.
Yeah, D.M. Bennett was a famous prosecution, and there's actually a campaign right now to have D.M. Bennett posthumously pardoned. The application is before the Biden administration right now. He hated freethinkers, and one prominent couple that he went after was the Haywoods. The Haywoods published The Word out of their home in Princeton, Massachusetts, in Worcester County, and they were kind of an amazing example of a modern monogamous couple that believed in equal rights between the sexes, fair division of household labor. And so I write about Angela Heywood, who was a major free thinker and free lover who's often overlooked in free thought history.
The Comstock Act was passed in 1873, but it was still going strong, and Comstock was still going strong into the 20th century. And that's really when the birth control movement got in earnest, and he went after Margaret Sanger. And in a sense, she was the one who triumphed against him in a court case in the 1930s after he died, didn't she?
Yes, and actually one of the last case that he was working on before he became ill, some believe that radical activists, including Emma Goldman, spread germs in the courtroom on purpose that caused Comstock's pneumonia. But the case that he was working on was Bill Sanger, Margaret Sanger's husband, and Bill Sanger had been decoyed and had sold a birth control pamphlet to someone who knocked on the door of his Greenwich Village art studio. And it's really quite amazing that was the last case he was working on. Margaret had fled the country to avoid her own case, although she later came back. And as I was saying before, around this time, 1915, you started to see articles in mainstream publications arguing that reproductive decisions should really be made by the family. And a couple of things were happening. Coeducation was taking off. Women's role in the workplace was changing. And so they had access to higher wage jobs. And then, of course, Emma Goldman was leading a really robust public discussion of the connections between women's economic freedom and their reproductive freedom. I always like to say I feel like Emma Goldman was sort of the Bernie Sanders to Margaret Sanger's Hillary Clinton. The birth control movement needed someone palatable to the American public who was also single issue. And so while Emma, frequently wrote and lectured about the intersections of different kinds of issues that women were facing, Margaret Sanger became single issue and really founded what came to be called as the birth controllers movement.
So in the conclusion of your book, The Man Who Hated Woman, you say that today women's wombs are still a battleground, but that reproductive freedom has never just been about reproduction alone. What does that mean?
Well, I go on to say in the passage you're quoting from that the women that I write about were also really interested in women's pleasure. And that was important to me to make this point in the book, and it's something that I speak about a lot, is that the orientation that they had toward what a woman's life should be was not only an orientation about the physical harm of repeated pregnancies and childbirths, but they also believed that women should have loving, pleasurable sex, and that their husbands should respect them, and that they shouldn't be raped within the confines of marriage, which of course was legal in most of the country at this time. And so that's very important to me, that I feel that in discussions of abortion rights, we also need to make sure that we talk about access to all kinds of reproductive freedom as being connected to access to pleasure.
Well, Amy Sohn, you have made the case against why we must oppose Project 2025, which wants to bring back the Comstock Act. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to see you again.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.